bombs are falling, if they showed them hit the ground, if you could see the bodies flying, if you could hear the sound, if you could see the rubble where the hospital once stood, if you saw the child's lifeless limbs, would you hold them if you could? If you knew that they were lying every time they spoke, for every laser-guided pinprick, there were lives lost in the smoke. If instead of just the generals, they had doctors too to describe the carnage of the cluster bombs, what if you knew? They were saying when they think you cannot hear, if you understood what they do, if for you it was so clear, if you knew they shut down the factory in an economic ruse, if you could kiss the cheek of the child in the sweatshop that made your shoes. Every time we went to war to fight our evil foes, they told you we were really fighting for the good of CEOs. If you could feel the hunger of the many, see the riches of the few, if they told it like it is, what if you knew?
David Rovics here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting on over 800 stations on Pacifica and NPR and low-power FM and college and community radio stations, on public access TV and PBS TV stations, and both TV satellite networks. Dish Network, Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410, Link TV, and on Direct TV, Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our headlines also available in Spanish for any radio station to take as over 250R. I'm Amy Goodman with Anjali Kamat. Our guest is Mark Potok, Director of Intelligence Project at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Anjali?
Mark Potok, can you explain to all of us how you would connect some of the incidents we just talked about regarding anger over the health care bill to the broader movement of extremist groups that your center has been tracking, and also talk about what you found in your latest report?
Well, I mean, let me start with what we found. What we found in the report was an absolutely enormous expansion in these groups in just the last year or so, year to maybe 18 months. A lot of it is connected very directly to the rise of Barack Obama, a black man to the White House. And that, I think, really is a representation of larger fears about the changing racial demographics of this country. The idea that whites will lose their majority in this country in the year 2050 is very, very frightening to a relatively large subset of Americans. So, you know, we found that the number of so-called patriot groups, which includes militias, had gone by a really astounding 244%. That works out to 363 new groups that appeared last year. We also saw a very big expansion in the number of extreme anti-immigrant groups, the so-called Minuteman groups. A number of hate groups, too, are record levels. So, you know, how does that connect to what we're seeing going on in the more mainstream political sphere? Well, I think that what has happened is that we see many politicians, many ostensibly mainstream cable news commentators, radio commentators, and so on, very much kind of pouring vitriol into the flames, pouring fuel on the flames. You know, what it seems to be is a kind of pandering for votes or pandering for ratings. But whatever the real reason is that these people are willing to engage in this kind of talk, you know, what has really happened is, you know, it begins in a sense with Sarah Palin saying not that she disagrees with proposed health care reform, but that the president is setting up death panels to decide whether our grandparents live or die. It begins with people like Tom Tancredo, the former Colorado congressman, saying Mexico is secretly planning to invade the United States and reconquer the American Southwest. And it goes on and on. When Glenn Beck on Fox News talks about the possibility that FEMA may be building and maintaining a set of secret concentration camps, when Lou Dobbs on CNN, as long as he lasted until late last year, talks about similar kinds of ideas about Mexicans invading the country, about so-called illegal aliens bringing leprosy to this country, and so on. All of this kind of propaganda is, first of all, entirely false, but I think more to the point, it's really defamatory and aimed at very particular groups of people. So, you know, Obama is a fascist, Obama is a Nazi, Obama is a Marxist. You know, this kind of talk, I think, obviously does absolutely nothing to further any kind of real political process, and in fact results in the kind of things we've been seeing in the last few weeks. So the rage on the right we write about is certainly very hot in the true radical right-wing groups, but what's extraordinary about what we're seeing right now is how it's leaked out into the much larger, much broader political process. I don't think you can describe the Tea Parties per se as extremist groups, but I also think that it is undeniable that they are shot through with extremist ideas like the secret Mexican invasion, like FEMA concentration camps, with strains of racism, and with many individuals who come out of harder line groups.
Mark Potok, what about the white power skinhead from Tennessee who's pleaded guilty to charges of conspiring to carry out a killing spree targeting African Americans that would culminate in the killing of then presidential candidate Barack Obama, Daniel Cowart?
Well, in some ways, it's an absolutely nutty plot the man had. This guy was a member, Daniel Cowart, of something called the Supreme White Alliance, and they really had this fantasy about absolute carnage. I mean, their whole plot was going to start with the murder of as many African-American high school students at a particular school as possible. I think the important thing to understand is that this is one of two racist skinhead plots to murder Obama that occurred even before he was elected. In addition, we've seen since then a man found in Maine to be building a dirty bomb which he intended to set off at Obama's inauguration. The day after the inauguration, another man, this man coming from a suburb of Boston, walked out of his house one day, the day after the inauguration, and started to murder black people. He told police later he intended to go on that night to murder as many Orthodox Jews as possible at a local synagogue. The reason? He had been reading on white supremacist websites that the white race in America was being subjected to a genocide. And it goes on from there. I mean, we have seen in the last year or so 6 different law enforcement officials murdered by right-wing extremists. So it's really heating up out there. What I'm trying to say is that the rise of Barack Obama to power has really sparked a kind of a vicious backlash, and I think, at least anecdotally, what seems very clearly to be an uptick in domestic terrorism, or at least planned domestic terrorism.
And Mark Potok, how would you say the rise in the right compares the period that we're living through right now compares to the period right before the Oklahoma bombings?
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities. I lived through that period and covered as a reporter the Oklahoma City bombing, and I remember very well the kind of general fury out there on the land directed at the federal government. In many ways, this is the sort of culmination of Republican demonizing, really, of the federal government. I recall that immediately after the Oklahoma City bombing, a poll was run which asked Americans whether or not they agreed with the proposition that the federal government was an imminent threat to their safety and civil liberties. 39% of Americans said yes at that time. At the time, I thought that was extraordinary and quite frightening. Today, that poll was rerun just a couple of weeks ago, and it was found that the number is now 51%. So, are we at the point where another Oklahoma City bombing is a possibility, or at least a worry? Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think there is a difference this time around, and that difference is really what I've tried to suggest already. It's a much broader-based movement. It's leaked out into the much larger political process. We see this kind of really incredible demonizing of certain groups of people going on in the Tea Parties, going on in big swaths of the Republican Party, and in other formations as well. So it's a scary time. It's probably worth saying that I don't think this means the country is, headed for rack and ruin and we're one step away from fascism. I think we are living through a backlash, much as was seen in this country after women got the right to vote, after the slaves were freed, when Catholic immigration began to change a formerly Protestant-dominated country. So, presumably we will get through this as well, but it's a tough time.
What about Joe Stack, Mark Potok, the Austin man who flew his plane into the IRS? It was remarkable how the media dealt with him versus those they call terrorists. They were actually careful not to call him a terrorist. I think the back and forth in a Newsweek email trail between editors was they decided not to do this because he could be your, neighbor next door. How does he fit into this picture?
Well, I think he is a part of it. To be fair, I think it's perfectly clear that Joseph Stack was mentally ill. That seems certain.